My name is Chandni Refutation, and today I'm going to be refuting the claim that affirmative action has a significant negative impact on students applying to higher education institutions in the United States. The advocate used two supporting claims to support his proposition, the first being that affirmative action fails to provide equal chances of admission for students to various universities in the United States, and the second being that the racial diversity resulting from affirmative action in these institutions fails to substantially benefit the social or academic experience of the students. In order to illustrate that affirmative action fails to provide equal chances of admission, the advocate provides two forms of evidence. Firstly, he provides a quote from an article titled "Affirmative Action in Law School Admissions, that's Minorities." The quote states that a study conducted on behalf of the Center of Equal Opportunity shows that at some schools, black applicants are more than 100 times likely to be admitted than whites with the same GPA and SAT scores. Based on a profile by Media Matters Action Network, the Center of Equal Opportunity is quoted to be fervently opposed to affirmative action. And I did my own research on this organization, and from a basic review of their website, it's clear that they are in fact opposed to affirmative action. Therefore, there's a high probability that this organization is a biased source because they wouldn't want to publish or support studies that oppose their anti-affirmative action opinions. And since it's highly probable that the source is biased, that evidence alone isn't sufficient to support the advocate's claim. Secondly, he quotes the USA Today article which describes a study on applicants to top colleges from 1997. This was back when SAT scores were on a 1600 scale, so the data is nearly 15 years old. The statistics show that Asian Americans need higher SAT scores than white or black students to have an equal opportunity of getting into elite colleges. Because the statistic is so old, I think its relevance is questionable, and without other statistics to support it, it wouldn't alone support the advocate's claim. The advocate also commits the fallacy of presumption and makes a hasty generalization by only using statistics from an article on affirmative action in law schools and a study of top colleges, which they're not specified, but in context of the article, it seems to be Ivy League schools or other elite private schools. Law schools and these elite universities aren't a representative or even a majority of all the higher education institutions out there in the US. The generalization completely ignores public schools, which are actually banned from considering race or ethnicity in the admission process. And the advocate's reasoning also assumes that GPA and SAT scores are the only factors that are considered for admission, and ignores other factors such as extracurricular activities or community involvement. To support his second claim that the racial diversity resulting from affirmative action in these institutions fails to substantially benefit the social academic experience of the students, the advocate refers to research on the consequences of diversity on a student body. Upon reviewing the article that summarizes this research, I found that the conclusions drawn by the advocate don't necessarily match the intended conclusions or all of the conclusions the author had. The advocate mentioned that students do see segregation. However, the research also found that the most common friendship group on campus is racially and ethnically mixed. This means that there was no majority ethnic or racial group in those friendship circles. So the quote that the advocate explains only showed the student's opinion of the situation was, whereas the information I provided shows what was actually found to exist. And when you combine these two findings, it shows that the diversity of this campus did actually have a positive effect on the social experience of the students. Based on the weaknesses I have identified in the advocate's argument, I hope you will agree that affirmative action does not have a significant negative impact on students applying to education institutions in the United States. Thank you.
All right, the claims are labeled pretty clearly as you're going along, and I think you do a good job of summarizing the advocate's argument on each of the points that's coming up. The first point, the initial challenge is to the bias of the source. The main challenge of bias is that they are not advocates of affirmative action. In fact, they are opposed to it. I'm not exactly sure that that's a surprise. The point of quoting somebody is that they have a point of view or an opinion on it. The question is, what is their, did they look at data that is inaccurate? Were they selective about choosing what data? And you've made a presupposition that because they have a point of view, they must have done that. And I think that that's a little less than convincing. You need something a little bit stronger than that. And in essence, you cite another organization to criticize the first organization, and my guess would be that somebody would say, hey, what's this organization all about? So there's always finger pointing and name calling that can go on. The question is, what's the data that they're using, and has it been used in a legitimate or an illegitimate way? And that's a problem that I see later on the second point, that you've got this argument, in essence, that says that the information that the advocate used was not being used in the way that the source that provided that information reached the same conclusion. They reached a different conclusion. In essence, you're suggesting that the advocate has distorted the meaning of the evidence there. So you've got to be very clear and explicit as to what the distortion is. You need to tell us, here's what the data says, here's what the advocate says that it says, here's what the author of the data inferred from it, and here's why I think that the advocate has read this data wrong. Otherwise, it just sounds like saying, liar, liar, you're making up stuff, and here's a completely different conclusion. And I don't know why your conclusion is any more valid than the conclusion the advocate came up with, because I'm not getting that context as clear as it needs to be. I like the analysis that you're putting on there, but it needs to be backed up a little bit more. I thought that you had a couple of good presses on the earlier argument also about what's representative, and the SAT scale and the timeliness of some of those kinds of things. I thought that was okay. When you basically challenge it being a hasty generalization because they're using elite colleges and universities and law schools. My guess is that those are the only ones on which affirmative action ever matters, because they're the ones that are selective about who gets in. You mentioned all the public universities. Their selective criteria is basically what can they accommodate and how many people are applying. I don't know whether affirmative action ever becomes an issue at those kinds of schools. That might be why all that data is there. But you have an interesting press on it, but that's about all it is. You did have one piece of information that says that public schools aren't allowed to do that. I know they're not allowed to do that in California and Texas, but I'm not sure that that is the policy in other states, that they aren't allowed to take note of affirmative action criteria and ethnicity and those kinds of issues. So if there is data on that, you should be citing that. If that's a piece of factual data, just tell us how you know that. All right, thank you.